Hello and welcome to the Allen Memorial Art Museum's webinar, Painting the American Wasteland, co-sponsored by the Presidential Initiative on Food Insecurity, funded by a New President's Grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. My name is Alexandra Letvin, and I'm the Assistant Curator of European and American Art at the Allen. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Maggie Cao. Professor Cao is David G. Fry Assistant Professor of Art History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. A scholar of American art and material culture, her work focuses on the intersections of art with histories of technology, natural science, and economics. Her first book, The End of Landscape in 19th Century America, was published in 2018 by the University of California Press. It examines the dissolution of landscape painting as a major cultural project in late 19th century America, and argues that landscape is the genre through which American artists most urgently sought to come to terms with modernity. Professor Cao has also written on media theory, material culture, and eco-criticism, and is presently at work on a new book entitled Painting and the Making of American Empire, 1830 to 1898, which will be the first synthetic treatment in American art history of 19th century art and overseas imperialism. We are so delighted to host her here today. At any time during the talk, you're welcome to type your questions into the question box at the bottom of your screen. They'll be hidden from view until we're able to address them after the talk. This event has closed captioning. If you would like to turn it on or off, you can do so by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. So thank you again for joining us today. Professor Cao, we will turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'd just like to thank Alexandra Letvin and everyone at the Allen Memorial Art Museum for inviting me today. And thank you all, the audience, for joining me wherever you're located. So before I begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So I'm speaking to you today from Durham, North Carolina. That is the traditional homelands of the Shakori, Eno, and Tuscarora people. And I want to honor the history and culture of the many Indigenous people with ties to this place, both past and present, in the interest of forming better relationships between our communities around this land in the future. Let me share my screen so that we can begin. This may not be the kind of landscape you'd readily label a wasteland. To our contemporary eyes, this probably looks quaint, idyllic, maybe like the wildlife refuge or conservation tract you'd find on an Audubon Society publication. But in 1868, when the American artist Martin Johnson Heade painted this work, The Great Swamp, it was a different story. Indeed, just a few years before this painting's completion, a naturalist named George Brady would declare that there are few scenes more dreary and depressing than an extensive salt marsh, especially when seen under unfavorable conditions of weather. So basically exactly what Heade has painted here. Others considered marshes more than just unpleasant. They were often deemed downright dangerous as marine wastes and plague-breeding swamps. The smells emanating from marshes was considered a public health hazard because what we know today to be mosquito-borne illnesses were then attributed to vapors that arose from waters in these wetlands. Even the marsh's limited usefulness, its production of wild hay that was harvested and stacked into the mounds that you see in this picture titled Salt Marsh Hay, was understood as anti-Arcadian, the opposite of the agrarian ideal we might associate with an artist like Camille Pissarro, whose work on the right that you can actually see in the current exhibition at the Allen. A Boston newspaper described the labor of harvesting the salt marsh hay from what this author calls fields resting on watery foundations to be both brutal and unpleasant. So instead, he says, of the sweet stinted breath of fresh mown hay, new mown hay, or the rest beneath cruel spreading trees, that sort of image of the ideal agrarian setting, we have on the salt marsh what he describes as sluggish ditches and stagnant pools and oozy malarious slime. So in today's talk, I will be looking at wetlands from the historic perspective of the mid-19th century United States and asking why certain painters were drawn to landscapes that were then considered wastelands. If these spaces were deemed unproductive and unaesthetic by the general public, then why were they artistically generative? Martin Johnson Heade would certainly have not been blind to these negative perceptions of salt marshes when he began painting them in the 1860s. A son of farmers from rural Pennsylvania, Heade started out as an itinerant portraitist, traveling around New England and the Midwest. In 1858, he decided he would devote his career to landscape painting. So he moved to New York City and he set up a studio in this building here where there was already a community of landscape painters that are now today known as the Hudson River School. His early landscapes done when he was based in New York are those of the eastern seaboard's beaches and rocky cliffs, views sought by wealthy city dwellers who summered at exclusive resorts and seasonal residences on nearby coasts. Salt marshes are also coastal, though outside the limits of these elite enclaves. Specifically, salt marshes are a kind of wetland that are found in the intertidal zone between land and sea, making it a shape-shifting kind of landscape that is daily altered by the tides. The areas around marshes at this time were inhabited by rural farmers, fishermen and farmers who knew how to navigate the tidal changes and to harvest the grasses that grew there. In spatial terms, then, the marsh was both an aesthetic as well as a social other kind of landscape of the coast. Painting the marsh, a landscape associated with the rural working class rather than the urban vacationer, meant turning one's back on the proper view. Literally, because to see the marsh, you'd have to turn your back to the sea, this preferred view. And metaphorically too, because it was an environment that really defied expectations for landscape painting at the time. And so what were the expectations of landscape painting? In a series of articles instructing aspiring artists in the art of landscape, the painter Asher B. Durand, who you see here, a founder of the National Academy in New York and the Hudson River School's most prolific publicist, he wrote in a series of articles that a good landscape should draw you into it. You traverse it, breathe its atmosphere, feel its sunshine, and repose in its shade. This idea that Durand promoted was a kind of landscape that was habitable, a landscape that had diverse topographical features, prospects, open pathways. And beyond that, the highest achievement of landscape painting was to embed in those natural features a kind of national or universal message or narrative. Durand's showpiece for his landscape theory is this painting from 1853 called Progress, or the Advance of Civilization. So where you can see that small human figures moving their way along the waterside path from this foreground in wagons into the distance where you see trains and steamships really kind of enact in this idealized way the narratives of westward expansion and technological advancement. In other words, the human figures that traverse this space in various vehicles from the foreground to the background enabled 19th century viewers to partake in national enterprises of expansion, technological progression, and political power. Of course, you might notice that in the shadows in the foreground, sort of wilderness area of this composition, are a group of Native Americans who stand witness over this landscape. And at this time, indigenous people were being removed to reservations. So they stand kind of in the foreground of the untamed wilderness, looking out beyond into the sun-drenched distance where there lies a frontier that is ready to be conquered or inhabited. So these are the kinds of mythologies and narratives embedded in American landscape painting. Heade's closest associate in the New York landscape circle was not Durand, actually, but the artist Frederick Edwin Church, who you see here, whose paintings offered fictions of traversal on an expanded scale, both physically, the actual canvases were really huge, and geographically, sort of the places in the world that he painted, as you can see here. His Church's 1859 painting, Heart of the Andes, is a massive canvas that stitches together views the artist collected when he went on a tour of Ecuador and Colombia. Beyond the richly detailed foreground of carefully rendered plants and animals is a lush and textured middle ground that opens up to those high peaks in the distance. Church's compositional strategy of combining views from different sites gives the fiction of traversal and inhabitation an even greater force. So in experiencing this picture, he believed that a viewer could come to know and, in a way symbolically possess not just any one particular viewpoint or a single environment, but in fact the whole of the Andes. That painting is called Heart of the Andes. Enthusiastic critics actually describe this painting as being a complete condensation of South America. And when this oversized artwork was exhibited on tour, went on tour throughout the United States, it attracted tens and thousands of visitors who would have seen it in a kind of theatrical surround, perhaps something like this in a period photograph. And at each stop, the painting was accompanied by this pamphlet you see here, which actually guided viewers through the space represented in the painting as if they were on a tour of this wilderness themselves. Advertisements for the painting also instructed viewers to bring opera glasses to the exhibition so that they could have a close-up view of the tropical plants and animals in the foreground, thereby replicating the kind of encounter that an explorer might have in the field. So paintings like this and the apparatus of display that often accompanied them made clear that American landscape painting played a role in justifying and fueling imperialist and ecologically destructive projects in the 19th century. Church and Durand may not have been vocally imperialist themselves, but part of the appeal of landscapes like Heart of the Andes was to unveil these regions to that were considered ripe for exploration and development. Now, this concurrence of painting and politics is most apparent in paintings of the American West by artists like Albert Bierstadt, and rival of Church's, who had a studio in that same building, in which in paintings by Bierstadt, we see indigenous people like those in Durand's Progress that I showed earlier as docile figures stuck in the past, so incompatible with this kind of idea of American expansion. Unsurprisingly, the collectors who ended up purchasing landscapes like these tended to be leaders in industries like railroads, mining, and shipping, the very sectors most closely tied to U.S. expansion. In other words, landscape art in this popular, much lauded form idealized a settler-colonial relationship to land, of exploration and knowledge production, and of ownership and improvement that predated or coincided with the making of actual territorial claims. Now, let's return to Heade's marsh landscapes, which do not fit this model. They resist narratives of traversal and conquest by virtue of their very subject matter. As one of the few natural terrains that humans cannot cross unaided, marshes are by definition already associated with conditions of impassability. So instead of being led on a guided tour from the jungle to the mountain peak, as you did in Heade's, as you did in Church's Andy's painting, viewers before Heade's paintings would have encountered obstacles rather than invitations to enter. They saw flooded meadows and streams, soggy ground that would not have been inviting. This is a landscape in which an explorer would sink into the earth rather than climb and scale mountains. At the most basic level, these paintings worked against viewers' expectations of landscape painting. The very thing that he'd emphasized was that which most troubled Americans about marshes and swamps in the first place, their watery substrate. This was a period in which every effort was made to turn wetlands into solid earth. The 1860s marked a major push for wetland reclamation in the United States with the passing of a series of swampland acts that ceded 65 million acres of wetlands to states for drainage projects like the one you see here, documented here. This happened not just on the eastern seaboard where Heade was painting, but also in California, where the Central Valley floodplain was transformed into the agricultural region we know it as today. In a rush to expand transportation networks, city boundaries, and arable land, mid-19th century developers relied on problematic methods of draining and diking. Their successes were often short-lived because they both lacked a firm understanding of flood management and faced retaliation from farmers and fishermen who depended on the marsh for their livelihood. During this reclamation boom, newspapers liked to claim that vast acreages of marsh worth little or nothing could be easily converted into lucrative real estate, but it often became the case that reclaimed land was never as solid and sound as promised. In 1872, Marshfield, Massachusetts, the subject of Heade's paintings, several of Heade's paintings, became the site of the most extensive reclamation experiments undertaken in New England. At the cost of $30,000, speculating landholders constructed a dam on the Green Harbor River to keep water out of the surrounding marshes. But by the 1880s, so not, less than a decade later, only a small percentage of the drained land had been brought to tillage. And even that, the newspapers reported, it was done in a very imperfect manner. In period accounts of reclamation projects gone awry, the land's wateriness was constantly seeping back to the surface, marking the marsh as stubbornly resistant to human settlement. In Boston, for instance, where developers transformed 450 acres of marsh in the Back Bay and South End into fashionable residential neighborhoods in the 1860s and 70s, an adjacent basin was inadvertently transformed into a stagnant drainage ditch that troubled residents with its foul stench. Only much later, in the 19th century, were these drainage problems resolved by the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, who recreated what else but a landscaped marsh at the site. Today, it's called the Fens, which utilized tides to flush out these pollutants. But even then, in the 1880s, when the when the Fens was realized, Olmsted refused to call his design a park because of the marsh's lack of aesthetic appeal. He insisted instead on calling the project an example of sanitation engineering. So Heade's paintings tend to highlight then not human ingenuity of power over landscape, but the landscape's assertiveness, its unpredictability. His canvases are filled with water, not just streams and floods, but storm clouds, sheets of rain, dampness in the atmosphere, the very liquidity that spoiled development projects of his time. The decision to paint these natural forces, the decision to paint these natural forces also posed a challenge to principles of landscape painting, which was, after all, linked to land-based enterprise, not water. Landscape was designed to be an art form that celebrated the potential of environmental engineering to make the landscape more hospitable, but no less beautiful. Rather than follow that genre's conventions, he'd used the marsh to express his skepticism towards the promises of human intervention in a landscape like the marsh. It does not come as a surprise then that Heade's paintings faced a tepid reception amongst American viewers who were accustomed to seeing paintings like churches or Durand's. Heade's marsh landscapes were criticized, and perhaps rightly so, for their wearisome horizontal lines and monotony of flatness. The problem with the marsh was its aesthetic banality. After all, the absence of all those visual qualities that made landscape painting exciting or exotic, in the work of his peers. To paint the unpleasing, the dull, the wasteland was Heade's way of challenging the expectations of his genre. Heade's most remarkable painting of a marsh painting is this one, in my view, which turns the very premise of landscape painting on its head. It features one of Heade's own landscapes up here, propped up on a sawhorse. Water from the painted marsh, when you see here, transcends its fictional space and cascades down onto the studio floor, where we also find this rather strange, grinning cartoon figure. On the one hand, you might say that this picture seems to celebrate landscape. After all, it calls attention to the genre's illusionism, with the conceit of that water turning truly fluid. The conceit being that, the landscape painter is so faithful to nature that the paint has come to life. But the addition of this very simply sketched studio space and this sneering cartoon figure, stick figure, in fact, suggests that the painting is no more believable than what amounts to a kind of amateur childlike drawing on this lower third. So, what was Heade's intention? Why would he poke fun at his own work in this way? Well, decades after this painting was made, a mythology arose around it. An account of its making, published in 1909 in the New York Herald, and this was after Heade's death, goes like this. Heade, who occupied Church's room for a while, and meaning Frederick Church, who painted the Heart of the Andes. So Heade, who occupied Church's room for a while, was painting a sunset, a meadow scene, and left a part of the canvas below the picture. When Heade went out, Church at once finished the lower part. The water from the meadow was leaking down in every direction. The effect was immense. Well, so there's only one truth to this anecdote, which is that Heade did occupy Church's studio for some time, and it is highly probable that this picture was painted there. But there's no evidence of collaboration or sabotage, if you want to believe the author here. I do, however, see this painting in dialogue with Church's works, which were such media spectacles in the artist's lifetime. Heade, we must remember, operated mostly in Church's shadow, painting pictures that challenge, as I've been trying to suggest, Church's brand of landscape painting. I can't help but read Heade's little picture as a parody of Church. The easel that Heade constructs out of these whole logs evokes Church's gigantic canvases, and the water that runs over the edge of his marsh looks a lot like the kinds of cascades that very often populated the middle grounds of Church's compositions. That this joke on Church's landscapes and their emphasis on traversability hinges on the salt marsh is particularly salient, since excess water, which is, pictured spilling over, is also what prevented movement through the space of the wetland. The joke, though, is not just on Church, but on the landscape genre more broadly. In the Western tradition, Landscapes are imagined as scenes viewed through a window or from a prospect up above, like a hill looking down at a valley, for instance. So, what you see in a landscape is what you emphasize in a landscape is the depth that you can imagine yourself moving across that space. Because this is a picture within a picture, it's not the horizon of the marsh that recedes into the distance, but the floor, the studio floor where the water pools. So, suppose we reject the notion that this artwork is a celebration of painting's illusionism and take it more literally, that what we have here is simply a waterlogged canvas that's been propped up to drip dry. Then the painting becomes an apt metaphor for the national endeavor of wetland drainage, a futile effort to dry up one space only to see wetness appear in detrimental ways elsewhere. So, whether Heade was proving himself to be a kind of ecological thinker with this painting isn't quite the right question to ask, I think. Ecology is a term that emerged right around the time that Heade was painting his marsh landscapes, but the study of environmental interaction, which gave birth to the environmental movement, is an entirely 20th century phenomenon. That said, Heade had very real reasons, very real concerns for the environment, and he was vocal about causes in conservation. Later in life, he would move to Florida, where he continued to paint wetlands, and there he published articles denouncing the hunting of exotic birds for their plumage. So we may not have any record about Heade's intentions in painting marshes, in painting marshes, but he was certainly engaged in a kind of pictorial revisionism, so challenging the conventions of a genre in a way that was really embedded in environmental concerns of what was going on the marshes all around him. My point then has been that spaces like salt marshes, which resisted projects of human occupation during the 19th century, were antithetical to landscape painting as a genre designed to affirm narratives of progress. Another type of wetland, the southern swamp, also proved ill suited for landscape painting, not so much because of its lack of topography, the critique leveled at Heade, but because of its overabundance that overwhelms efforts to make visual sense of space. It was even more than the salt marsh, a kind of impassable landscape. The swamp's appearance in paintings of the Civil War era, though rare, also offers a counter narrative to landscape painting's orientation towards narratives of settlement and expansion. This counter narrative, though, is less embedded in ecological transformation than it is in the politics of race. In 1862, Thomas Moran painted this view of the Great Dismal Swamp, an area that originally covered over 1 million acres of Virginia and North Carolina. It was then considered among the most inhospitable tracts of land in the United States because so little of it was even above water. It bore all of the same negative associations that I talked about with the salt marsh, the smells deemed poisonous, the sort of muck that keeps you from moving through it, insects, and on top of that, poisonous creech snakes and other things. Like the coastal marshes of the North, drainage efforts had proven unsuccessful, so white settlers in the region deemed it a wasteland. Environmental and geographical circumstances thus made the Great Dismal Swamp a longtime refuge for escaped slaves. Some used it as a route of passage to coastal Virginia where they could board ships north, and others settled there in maroon communities in the interior. During the Civil War, the swamp as a refuge became increasingly visible as Maroons who had been living in the swamp joined the Union cause either by enlisting or by aiding Union troops' efforts through guerrilla warfare. So Moran's scene here recalls many literary accounts of slaves taking refuge in the swamp by abolitionist authors. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's A Slave in the Dismal Swamp from his 1842 poems on slavery describes an escaped slave hiding in the vegetation with the lines, "Where hardly a human foot could pass or human heart would dare, on the quaking turf of the green morass he crouched in the rank and tangled grass." The Great Dismal Swamp is also the setting of Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1856 novel Dread, in which the titular character is one of those maroons who rescues escaped slaves and helps them cross the swamp. Stowe describes southern swamps as regions of hopeless disorder, where the abundant growth and vegetation of nature seems to rejoice in a savage exuberance and bid defiance to all human efforts either to penetrate or subdue. This swamp then signifies differently for Black and white Southerners. For whites, it was a space of savage, dangerous, disordered nature. For the enslaved, it was that too, but also it held the promise of freedom. And Moran's painting, which was destined for an abolitionist collector, offers the pictorial equivalent of the kinds of descriptions that abolitionist writers made of this landscape. Moran highlights the swamp's conditions that make it inhospitable. The tangled overgrowth threatens to engulf the escapees who are dwarfed by surrounding vegetation and sinking into murky water. Ahead, there are a few open pathways, but and just behind them, pursuing slave catchers, which here, and two dogs are closing in. The night setting further emphasizes the environment's limited visibility. Even in figureless paintings of the southern swamp, scenes that do not make explicit reference to slavery, such as this work by the French-American painter Regis Francois Junot, nature is depicted in a kind of sinister way. The low perspective here makes us feel submerged in the water, and the all around, the branches and stumps of vegetation. So I'm looking like this, and these sort of limb reaches out like arms and legs, echoing the sinewy body of this heron in the foreground, the only visible creature. Moran and Junot were both Northern artists, though we have no record of their views on abolition. We do know that Moran painted a second version of his slave hunt for a fundraising exhibition for the Union cause in 1864, where it appeared actually with Church's Heart of the Andes. Moran was at the time quite a young artist, and unlike Heade, was not otherwise critical of the landscape tradition. His big break came actually after the Civil War, when a railroad mogul offered to pay Moran to take part in a government-sponsored geological survey to the Yellowstone region. The survey's intent was to map still unincorporated territories of the United States, as well as to collect data on geological and environmental conditions in the West for future occupation and settlement, an enterprise which, as we know, displaced and decimated indigenous populations. In his paintings of the Western frontier, Moran transformed the region's most difficult, impassable terrains into majestic and traversable vistas. While exploration and migration to the West were fraught with dangers, Moran never emphasized the treachery of humans encountering the forces of nature as he had in his slave hunt. The aesthetic power of these paintings were instrumental in actually convincing Congress to deem the Yellowstone region a national park, though that protection was less in the name of conservation than recreation. Moran became kind of poster child for Yellowstone in his later career. Prints of his paintings were sold as souvenirs. His paintings hung in hotels and railroad depots. He adopted the middle name Yellowstone for his signatures. There's actually a place at Yellowstone National Park called Moran Point. Slave hunt then is a kind of anomaly in the art of Suv. A picture that, while hinting at the potential of landscape painting to challenge settler colonial relations to terrain, does not ultimately change the discourse. At the height of his fame, Moran did on occasion return to picturing wetlands, those near his home on Long Island, the subject of this small etching of rural marsh scenery, which is actually in Allen's collection. In every sense, this print rejects the enormity, drama, and saturation that characterize Moran's paintings of the West. They were also created in close collaboration with his wife, the gifted printmaker Mary Nemo Moran, whose landscape subjects were limited due to her domestic duties to the marshes, dunes, and farmlands near their home. For Thomas Moran, whose work was so intertwined with projects of American expansionism, the marsh by this time, the 1880s, was perhaps a space of respite, allowing him to engage in an intimate rather than politically charged project. In the mid-19th century, marshes and swamps were a kind of anti-landscape, an antidote to the prevalent expansionist views of nature. As a result, we can trace in the work of Heade and Moran a generative friction between two parallel histories. The first, art historical, about the development of landscape as a national genre, and the other, environmental and political, about the resistance of wetlands to reclamation and settlement. The latter, the history of the wetland as wasteland, proved creatively generative, allowing painters to question or step outside a landscape tradition built on settler colonial narratives. Although now we recognize the benefits of wetlands for protection against flooding and erosion, for cleansing water and air of pollutants, there is actually still a bias against these spaces that stems in many ways directly from the 19th century landscape tradition. On Earth Day last year, then President Donald Trump planted a ceremonial maple on the White House South Lawn to honor, as he put it, the country's heritage of conservation through the 1 Trillion Trees Initiative, which is a very big deal. The initiative to which he's referred is a global reforestation campaign launched in 2018 to combat climate change. Tree planting looks good and makes for excellent photo ops, in part because of a longstanding favoring of the terrestrial forest over marshes and swamps in our understanding of nature's aesthetic worth. To offset carbon emissions, restoring wetland would actually be much more efficient. Peat, a wetland material, now covers only 3% of the planet, but it stores twice as much carbon as all of the world's forests, which make up 30% of the world's land surface. Historic reforestation efforts, like those in parts of the UK, are now being undone at great expense and labor to restore wetland habitats. When we plant forests, we are engineering our landscape, modeling it after the ideals of wilderness that 19th century painters embedded in their narratives of imperialism and racial superiority. Such narratives, except in the select cases that I've discussed today, left little room for the visual and aesthetic resistance of marshes and swamps. I'll end today with just an example from recent art that returns us to the wetland's historic meanings. A series of photographs taken in 2008 to 2012 by the Southern artist Sally Mann of the Great Dismal Swamp, which, by the way, because of reclamation, actually is now just 5% of its original size. These small haunting images are taken using a 19th century photographic technique called the tintype, a technology once used to make cheap portraits of Civil War soldiers on the battle, Civil War soldiers sort of at camp, many of whom perished on the front. Tintypes are one of the earliest photographic technologies, and it actually fixes the image directly onto the exposed iron sheet, so that rather than making a print from an exposure, the sheet itself is the photograph, and it embeds the positive and negative image in it, so that as you kind of move the photograph, you see a negative or a positive image, thus giving this kind of technology, these images, a kind of ghostly charge. That dark history plays a part in Sally Mann's revival of the technique for landscape, particularly when those landscapes are of the Great Dismal Swamp. These nocturne-like images that you see eerily register the swamp's double-sidedness for African Americans in the antebellum South, which is here literal, that the negative and positive inflections of the photograph, and metaphorical, the promise of refuge playing against the threat of danger, threat of hazard and peril. Our growing ecological consciousness about the benefits of wetlands will, I hope, push us not just to see and admire the beauty of these landscapes in the present, but also allow those landscapes to tell counter histories of race and class in America. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Cao, for this really fascinating talk. I want to just encourage all of our participants to feel free to leave any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we will address them. And maybe we can just start with a question that I had, which was that I was really struck by the period photo of the heart of the Andes, with the kind of what looked like 3 presidential portraits above the landscape. And I was curious if you could tell us a little more about how some of these anti-landscapes would have been displayed. So if we have any period photos of them, or if we know much about like who the audience would be, like who might want to buy one of these paintings.
Yeah, so these paintings, so Moran's slave hunt is kind of a singular thing in his practice. So that and it was painted specifically for someone who commissioned the work. So he already had a buyer who is an abolitionist, buyer. Heade's paintings, he painted, like dozens and dozens of marsh landscapes. They were really small. So that's one thing that's really important to note, that, in contrast to the churches, they were quite tiny. And they, there was quite a market for small landscape paintings, I would say. And so they did fit into that kind of market. When you read the criticism, you get the sense that, people were sort of like uncertain about this landscape, but clearly there was, he made a lot of them. So there must have been buyers. He would have shown them in galleries perhaps, and also the studio itself. Artists would open up their studio to the public at various points in time, and there would be sort of these tours of the studio where they would show off their work.
Oh, interesting. So we have a question from David Egloff, who is asking, do we know if Heade might have read George Perkins Marsh's 1864 Man and Nature, in which many basic principles of the environmental movement were clearly articulated?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if he'd read that particular work, but I do think there are these moments in the 1860s when certain thinkers in the United States were kind of ahead of their time in understanding ecological relationships. And I think there is some kind of influence in terms of, artists picking up on that. So we don't know for sure whether he would have read it, but it certainly is something that is within the realm of influence.
So we have a question from Professor Ann Sheriff. She says, thank you for a fascinating talk. In the discourses of American landscapes of the time, were there religious or spiritual qualities attributed to or associated with majestic landscapes and to the radically horizontal landscapes that evoke wetlands?
There were certainly religious or spiritual associations. Church, for instance, often included these, iconographic details related to Christianity in his paintings. And certainly there's ideas of, in Christian thinking of the time of, the divine in relation to nature. As far as Heade's paintings and their horizontality, I don't know that I'm not sure that would necessarily have been read in a religious manner. Just the formats of the paintings. To me, the format is in a way, I think, to emphasize the sort of flatness of the land itself. So the format actually makes you think that this land is sort of this like broad expanse. The very things that, critics kind of disliked about them are emphasized by that longer format.
Yeah, it's remarkable to see, and to see so many. It's really I mean, I think we've all perhaps seen kind of landscapes like that, and it feels very evocative. So we have a question from Barb Pryor, who's our art librarian. So she's asking about the gremlin in the studio painting, which is also one of my favorites. I'm wondering if the easel actually, okay, I'm wondering if the easel is actually two log benches, creating the illusion of a three-dimensional marsh. In a related question, is it my imagination, or is there water dripping from the small pond closest to the edge? So not over the edge of the painting, but from within the depth of the painting.
I hope I'm understanding the question correctly. So the conceit is that it's a painting set on two logs. So the logs are kind of these, there are little legs on the logs. So the logs are kind of like a makeshift easel onto which the painting is set, which is, kind of, I think, a joke about church, because Heade's paintings were really small. If you set them on logs, it would just, it wouldn't look like that. So it's almost like he blew up his own paintings to set them on these logs. The water, it looks like the water is kind of this flooded area in the foreground of the marsh. In the sort of marsh painting looks like the water is kind of just like dripping over the edge. And in fact, there's actually a second version of that paint. So there's a second gremlin in the studio painting that has a different embedded painting, but it's the same premise. It has the little cartoon figure too. And in that one, it's the same thing. So it's also a kind of like flooding of the marsh that that sort of leaks out.
Great. So we have a question from Mark Cole, which kind of gets to some of Heade's other paintings. So he's asking if you would ascribe colonialist or expansionist readings vis-a-vis Church's Heart of the Andes to Heade's South American orchid and hummingbird paintings.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. So I've actually written about those paintings, specifically those hummingbird paintings with the giant orchids. Those are, I think, also kind of critical engagement with church, even more so than the marsh, because of course they're the same subject. They're also South America, they're also the tropics. So what I see going on in those paintings is also a kind of like rejection of the idea of traversability, the narrative of encountering the landscape and being able to enter, because in those paintings you have in the background a kind of classic kind of church-like tropical landscape. But then instead of allowing the viewer to kind of enter into those landscapes, he basically puts in the foreground these like giant flowers and birds and branches and vines. So things that really act as a kind of obstacle course. So what you're paying attention to is actually the, the specimens, or the natural history specimens, rather than a kind of relationship to landscape.
Sure. And maybe for some of our viewers who are perhaps not as familiar with Heade's work, I wonder if you could just kind of speak a little bit about how the paintings you were looking at today kind of fit into his broader output, if this is something he kind of engages with, as I think you're suggesting, kind of throughout his life, as a sort of creative outlet, and kind of what some of the other types of paintings he made are.
Yeah, really, Heade is known for two types of paintings: the marshes, which I showed many of, and these hummingbird paintings, which I just described, which came out of this trip that he took to South America after a few years after Church went. And Heade was really interested in natural history. He loved hummingbirds. He kind of had this like obsession with them. He wanted to create a natural history album of hummingbirds. And so he went to South America to collect specimens, to study birds. And he ended up, many of the things that he learned and he studied there ended up becoming the basis of a huge body of work that is mostly these still small canvases, but they're kind of tropical landscapes in the background with these they seem to be blown up almost, but they're actually life-size hummingbirds and orchids, mainly orchids, some passion flowers.
Thank you. So we have a question from Philip Koch, and he asks, Maggie, you mentioned how Heade's marsh paintings were less popular with collectors than more traditional Hudson River School imagery. Was Heade able to support himself through selling his work, or did he have other sources of financial support? Which certainly kind of maybe also leads into this question of how he went to South America.
Yeah, he certainly was never a lucrative artist. And, this is really key because when you look at sort of the history of the landscape market in this moment, you have a lot of documentation about how how artists like Church, Bierstadt, these artists making these large landscapes about sort of the frontier or something exotic were making a lot of money. Their canvases were selling for like $10,000. It's a huge amount during that time. We don't, Church's paintings certainly had a market. He did sell them, but we know that he just didn't have that same kind of audience. People paid to go to exhibits of Church's Heart of the Andes, for instance. He charged. Church, and in fact, one of the reasons that Heade is making paintings in Church's studio is because, for financial reasons, probably just, he needed a space to work, and Church was traveling all the time and things like that. Heade eventually moves to Florida and kind of like retires there, I guess. But he never kind of gained the same kind of fame. He never made the kind of, fortune out of landscape painting that other painters did.
So we have one more question, which is maybe a nice way to wrap up, which it comes from Saeed Farhan Shakil, who says, Professor Cao, how and why did you research this subject? What was your inspiration? This is a very unique yet very interesting subject area and very impressive presentation.
Thank you. Well, so I think I came to have an interest in this topic through Heade's paintings of those hummingbirds that I mentioned. I was in graduate school in Boston, and there are a couple of them in the museum, the MFA museum in Boston. So I'd see them, and there was always something really strange about the way that space is conceived in those paintings. And so I really was, I was always trying to figure out like, what's going on with these paintings? Why are they so awkward almost? Because they're like these seemingly giant flowers in front of these like, vistas of tropical vistas. And so that's really what led me to start thinking about what was Heade's relationship to the practice of landscape during his time, whose work was he looking at? And then I found sort of connections with Church, that they were working out of the same studio, that he was traveling to the same places, but really was doing something very different.
Thank you. So I lied, and we actually have one more question from Oberlin student Kieran Williams, who is asking, she's just wondering if Heade or Moran would regard the pre-Raphaelites, kind of particularly small scale, intimate works in any particular light.
Question. Yeah, the pre-Raphaelites play an interesting part in this kind of dialogue of the studies, artist engagement with nature in the middle 19th century. So for, those in the audience who don't know who the pre-Raphaelites are, they are this group of artists that are really influenced by British art of the time and doing these very, very intricately detailed studies of nature, but often they are like studies of small things in nature, like, one plant or like a bird's nest, and it was the idea behind that movement was really to this idea that if you look closely at the details of a very small thing, that you can actually grasp something larger. And so it certainly is related, I think, to other kinds of landscape painting by the Hudson River School, because there is this notion that, landscape can have this universal message. I don't think that pre-Raphaelite painting has the same relationship to a kind of political engagement with terrain as Hudson River School painting of the time.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for a really fantastic presentation and a great Q&A. So thanks everybody for joining us. And I think we will end the webinar here.
Thanks, everyone.